guideline for you in terms of this is what the process should look like. This is when I want your deliverables. They know how to brief you, what to brief you on. They know how, what success looks like. Whereas clients in this space, they just don't often. They don't have experience because they are the inventors of something, not chief marketeer or in that field. And so that means that some of the experience is just lacking, and you'll have to be far stronger in your consultation ability. So your ability to guide a client through the process and explain, what are the criteria for success that you should be looking for in this presentation. Also understanding that, a camel is a horse designed by committee, this kind of stuff. Like, it just takes a lot more work. And in some cases that means that you have to kind of take 15-year step back in the evolution of branding, because you'll just really have to explain, like, dude, I can't deliver you a logo set and then you making it blue and changing it into a triangle next week. Because that's the stuff that happens. And it's interesting that in a way you could switch the sector and be totally unsatisfied. It's not at all the case that working for people who do something good will change the way you feel about the work that you're doing. It could actually aggravate some of the things that you're experiencing with your commercial clients. You'll actually end up probably loving your commercial clients for certain things, like saying yes to an estimate.
Well, I was going to say, on the back of that, I guess, in my design practice, I often work with startups or emerging businesses, many of whom feel they already have a brand, even though they may not have produced a product or service yet. They tend to think brand as a logo. And in your book, you state, a brand is not built overnight, but requires years of work. Is this something that the startups that you work with generally understand and accept, or is it a surprise to them?
I think for a number of them it is, and for a number of them they feel like you do, and so their eyes are opened up through the workshops that we do, where we use the brand thinking canvas, and they understand, this is something bigger. I also think it depends if it's a first-time entrepreneur or not, because you have startups that are run by people whose, this is their sixth company, and they know the difference. What I think is interesting is that for almost everyone we work with, you have to start with, you're at zero. You have to start with the first client, the first customer, the first investor, the first press contact. And so it's just so, I don't want to say naive, but it just speaks to someone's inexperience if they think, it's a logo. And if I look at, for instance, how much time we invest at Internet of Elephants, for instance, where I'm the brand manager, in just simply getting following, and how many products. So we chose this lean development process for the product, and opening it up, and along the way hopefully gathering a movement around the product. That's now been 2 years. And now we're getting a lot of, now we're reaping the results, or harvesting the results. So we became one of the Fast Company's most innovative companies of 2018, for instance. And there was a National Geographic Explorer grant, and we got really good press in TechCrunch. And but that took 2 years. It's, It's not like, we built something, let's send people an email, it'll be in a newspaper, and here we go. And I think kind of there's this myth that if you build it, they will come, but it's just not the case. For 99.9% of us, it's not. And unfortunately, that means that you're just going to have to build it one person at a time.
Now, you mentioned Internet of Elephants, and I was going to come to that. It was recently included as Fast Company's one of their most innovative companies. Some people may still, and you might disagree with me, but I think some people still might be skeptical of social enterprise companies being sustainable and innovative. Internet of Elephants challenges that. You know, it is on an innovation list, very respectable list. And the fact that it is must also validate the work that you do as well. So obviously building that brand over 2 years and then getting to this stage with Fast Company, it must be a great validation for the work that you've been doing. So are we seeing social enterprise turn a corner where they're now accepted in the same manner as some of the most established and innovative businesses? If so, what do you think is behind that development?
I think out of the whole tech development came this idea that that your tech somehow needs to have a social impact, and so I think it's kind of running gag on Silicon Valley that you have to start your pitch with like, okay, we're going to change the world and we're going to do it by building a more efficient newsletter system. But I think that's one. I think another aspect is that businesses with purpose are just consistently showing really great results versus competitors. So if you look at Patagonia or Tom Shoes, I think I often have to check with people, like, what's your definition of social enterprise? Because for me, it's not like the orphanage. It's not saving the seals. It's not activism or charity. Social enterprise is very much like business plus impact, and one doesn't work without the other. And so, in a way, I think, for instance, Tom's is very well known as a social enterprise, where I would say, like, in a way, it's a business with a charity. Yeah, it's not really built into the business model. And so, the companies that I would hold true to the definition of social enterprise, they would definitely fall in the innovative space, because there's just, 20 years ago, there just weren't that many people trying to make a difference through business. And so I think, interestingly enough, the vegetarian corner store or the hemp t-shirt maker, those were exceptions. Like Whole Foods, I think, is a really interesting case study of, a guy who starts one shop and has built it out to, enormous scale. And if you see how well Whole Foods does, that's incredible. And I think the more innovative they are, the bigger reach of audience they can have, and that's where, for me, that's what's really the difference with some of the more traditional charities or good causes, is that they're not necessarily focused on reaching new audiences. They're focused on reaching an existing audience of people who are already converted. And I think we shouldn't be selling vegetarian burgers to vegetarians. We should be selling them to meat eaters, and as many as possible. So that's where my commercial mind, because I definitely have a commercial mind, comes in. Like, oh, okay, great. You don't want to be creating a difference for 500 people. You want to make a difference for hundreds of thousands of people. And I think coming from Europe, which is obviously very set in its ways and in a very nostalgic society, coming to a continent where there is a lot of progress happening as we speak. Like, there's just, I can't count the amount of insane skyscrapers and apartment blocks that are going up in the 2 years that I've been here. Makes you realize, like, oh yeah, there's a whole world out there. And of course, I'm not saying there's anything wrong with making a difference for one person. It's great. There's nothing wrong with it. But we need people who are also reaching 200 million people and who are raising 30 million for conservation instead of 1,000. And when you live on a frontier, you are much more confronted with that, I think, than if you're living in, like, the city where I'm from. It's had the same look and feel for 500 years. There's nothing that's changed. There's bicycles and cars, but apart from that, the buildings are the same. And so there's a very different, that just creates a very different mindset.
It's interesting because we don't necessarily talk about the pitfalls of social enterprise, and in your book you mentioned Tony's Chocolates as a case in point where difficulties often do arise, and in Tony's Chocolate case it was slavery in the supply chain, or at least they couldn't ensure that there wasn't slavery in the supply chain. And equally with Tom Shoes, there's recent issues there with their supply chain. So how can companies use branding, if at all, to avoid issues like this?
I think they can't. I think the issues that these companies are trying to tackle are extremely complex. So, for instance, Tony Chocolonely, they are facing a situation where it's just, they set out to, as a kind of interesting activism project, they set out to create one chocolate bar that was slave-free. And that in itself was so incredibly difficult. And it's taken them 10 years to get to the point where they're now, I don't know it entirely by heart, but I think like by now 99% of the chocolate bar they can guarantee is slave-free. But I think you can say like, oh, okay, but that's an ethical issue and therefore their whole company or their whole brand is irrelevant. But what they're actually showing is because they're now the market leader in chocolate in the Netherlands, and they're showing all of the other companies, Milka, Droste, all the big chocolate companies, Nestle, that ethical is wanted and ethical makes you desired, and it can be profitable, because Tony's Chocolonely is one of the they don't spend much money on marketing, for instance, so they have an incredible return on their products. And people love it. People just love it. Everything they do, people love it. And I think that example that they're stating is really important. And I think it was, I think I talk about it somewhere in the book, but I'd have to look it up for you. But I think there's someone at Patagonia who had a really, really good quote. And he said, if that he could spend the entire day arguing with his team about getting to the 100% most ethical solution, and in the process they could ruin the business because they're not going to actually get there. So also understanding that all these things are works in progress and that we need to prototype things instead of delivering one thing that works 100%, I think is really important.
But with branding, because it's communications, isn't there an opportunity or a role for branding to, if not explain those issues better, but the whole branding machine that might be behind some of these organizations, even if they are social enterprise, can start to lay down the context and lay down why 90% or 99% or 98% is acceptable?
I think there is, and I think these companies are trying very hard. I think nuance is just a very tough thing, especially when you are talking to people who aren't as invested in the context that you're working in as you are. For instance, for Tony's, if they share, information about the complexity of the supply chain, there's not a lot of people who are interested, and they presented really, nicely, beautifully fun, but there's not a lot of people who are interested in that. There's many more, you'll get 500 likes if you talk about a new flavor of chocolate, and you'll get 6 likes if you talk about, sign a petition to help us get Milka to use fair trade cocoa butter. I experienced the same. So for instance, with Internet of Elephants, it's really, so what we're trying to show is that you can donate to a charity that supports conservation. But we also want you to think about animals, and we also want you to think about how your behavior affects, for instance, climate change. Like, we can save an elephant, but if if droughts are going to continue, we're going to lose them anyway. It's not going to be poaching, it's going to be drought. But these things are really, really hard. And if you're working with a product that already has a lot of complexity, and then the impact model has a lot of complexity, that becomes really a challenge. So of course it would be great if, and this is also why Tom's 1 for 1 is incredibly appealing to people, while it's actually, in my eyes, a completely wrong impact model. So people understand, oh, I buy a pair, I give a pair. It's like, yeah, but there's a whole complexity around the fact that we shouldn't be giving away shoes because they ruin a local economy. No shoemaker in the local country will be making money off it. And when people have this idea like, oh, we should be sending free clothing to all these places, free shoes, that's a lot of, that's 20 or 30 years of indoctrination that you need to get out of people's minds. and you're just not going to do that with your, $5,000 marketing budget a year. And so I think, the communication of the complexity is definitely something that you try to do, but it's very hard.
Yeah, I don't know if you're aware of this, that Larry Fink is the founder of BlackRock, which is, as of 2017, oversees 5.7 trillion in assets under management. Recently, he sent an email to the CEOs stating that BlackRock will now be assessing the CEOs of the portfolio businesses that they manage, that BlackRock will now be assessing their portfolio based on those companies' purpose, not just their profits. We're seeing other significant businesses follow suit, and purpose has become more and more important in business, and that's far beyond the tokenistic corporate social responsibility that we've seen for many years. So many of these businesses are struggling with how they can incorporate that kind of purpose into their business. So how do you think that a large, complex organization could learn from a smaller, more agile social enterprise when seeking to introduce this genuine social purpose into their business? How do you think they can do, or can they learn from social enterprise?
Yeah, well, a lot of companies that are struggling with finding their purpose, they came of age a while ago. And so, you started creating fridges because food was being wasted, people were getting sick. And so a fridge was a really great solution to help people stay healthier and feed their families and have more prosperous families. But 60 years later, no one can say like, oh, I work for a fridge company and like sit there and be proud of themselves. Yeah. And you've lost that sense of purpose. And now 20,000 people are creating fridges around the world. And I think in that sense, it's really, really difficult if you have a product that's basically a mainstream product or service that doesn't really affect people's lives anymore. And I do think that the innovation process, therefore, is so high on every company's list, because they need to find what more do people need, what are their pains around food and keeping food and keeping your family healthy, and doing product development from that perspective. I think in some cases companies also just really don't get it. So an example, we worked with a bank in the Netherlands that's traditionally my great-grandfather was one of the founders of this bank. They were farmers who set up a corporation because they weren't getting money from banks, and the farmers would loan to each other. And nowadays it's one of the banks that was involved in a scandal. So they were trying to get back to their roots of being this kind of cooperative bank. And so they wanted to know mostly about how do we communicate that. But they weren't so interested in, for instance, changing the criteria with which their sales managers were being judged for their work lending money to people. So if you're saying like, oh, we want to be cooperative again and support in the community, then you should ask your salespeople, how many loans have you given to community-based companies that would really make a difference here? And so if you're not putting the economic incentives with your team where your mouth is, then it's not going to work. Interestingly enough, this bank also didn't pay my bill. And it took me a year and a half to get paid. And I just felt like this is exact. And we had this, 3-hour conversation about why people hate banks. And it's just like, if you're that thick-skulled, I'm sorry, you're going to go the way of the dinosaur, because you're just, sorry to say it, but those people are just clueless.
Now, there is a direct link between brand and business, and increasingly designers are working closely with founders and business leaders. As a result, we often find ourselves advising on business models, just like we're talking about here, and business strategy. However, few designers are trained in business. In your experience, how can a designer reconcile the fact that they are often in a position to advise business leaders, yet may have no formal training or experience in business?
Yeah, we keep our fingers crossed, don't we?
Yeah, we do.
I do that all the time.
Yeah,
Like,
but